also think it's important that you started us out with that, Barbara, because my talk is about drone warfare, and the premise of drone warfare is a racist one. We're not killing wealthy white kids in wealthy white countries. We're killing poor people of color, mostly 18, 19 years old, in poor countries, and getting away with it as a country. So the violence that we do unto others is unfortunately reflected in the violence in our own society. When I look at this issue of drone warfare, it really comes out of a policy that believes that we can fight the injustices against us of 9/11 by what's over now a decade of killing, and just keep the killing going. We've killed so many people since 9/11, so many times over the people that were killed in the World Trade Center. And it just keeps on going and going. And Barbara, you made me reflect on somebody that we met in Pakistan. And as we're recognizing people, I want to recognize a young woman here, Chelsea, who went to Pakistan with us. And Chelsea, how old are you? 23. Saved her money by working in a retail store to pay for the airfare and pay all our expenses to go to a country that people only hear about when they talk about violence. And I hope you don't mind me saying against the wishes of your family, because she felt it was so important as a young person to go and try to meet face to face with people who have been the victims of our own policy. So why don't you stand up for a minute, Chelsea, and let's recognize the beauty of this young woman here. So the US responded to 9/11 with a policy of invasion. On the one hand, invading Afghanistan instead of going in to try to find the individuals who attacked us on 9/11. And then in addition to that, used it as an excuse to invade a country that had nothing to do with 9/11, and that is Iraq. Most Americans couldn't tell you anything about what happened in Iraq. We took a country that was already suffering from a dictatorship and 13 years of sanctions, and we destroyed that country. Destroyed that country, killed who knows how many people, over hundreds of thousands, if not millions. Millions are displaced, and we have no accounting to do for that. Nothing. Reparations, that's a joke. Just keep going on with the military machine. But it turns out that while the American people were all gung-ho about those invasions in the early years after 9/11, 10 years later, they were, what are we fighting for? Why are we in Afghanistan? What was Iraq all about? Why are we losing our own soldiers in something that we don't even understand? Why are we spending so much money when we need that money here at home? And the polls just changed dramatically. And the powers that be in this country recognize that they couldn't keep going with this kind of boots on the ground war, but they wanted to keep going with the wars. And that's where the drones come in. They allow us to keep the wars going, supposedly on the cheap. Cheaper than $1 million per soldier in Afghanistan, cheaper than the more expensive airplanes that had pilots in them. And the American people believe this. In fact, when they did a poll in February of 2012, 83% of Americans said it was just fine to use these drones to kill terrorist suspects. This relates so much to the Trayvon Martin issue, because we're allowed to kill people on the basis of racial profiling. Because you know who were the terrorist suspects, Barbara? You know who they were? Any male of military age living in the areas where we are using these drones. That's a militant, by definition. I mean, that is just absolutely astounding to think that this administration and the Bush administration gave the CIA and the military the right to kill any young person, any young male in the countries where you're using the drones. And that 83% of the American people said that was just fine. That included a majority of Republicans, or a majority of Democrats, a majority of independents. It didn't include a majority of Greens. But it included a majority of people who called themselves liberal Democrats. Imagine that. Sold a bill of goods, a faulty bill of goods, that these drones were somehow the great savior. Drones, by the way, come in all shapes and sizes. Some of them can be used for good things, like fighting forest fires or tracking endangered species. But I'm talking about the deadly drones, the Predator drones, the Reaper drones, the drones that are piloted here in the United States in Air Force bases to kill people thousands and thousands of miles away. People who these pilots have never seen, countries they've never visited, cultures they've never experienced. They are given the godlike authority to press a button to kill people thousands of miles away while they are sitting in air-conditioned rooms, in ergonomic chairs, and at the end of a day that might include having pressed the button to kill somebody. They then go back to their homes, to their families, to their children, to coach the soccer game, to go to church. That's how the killing is done in this new modern warfare. We have no idea how many people we've killed with these drones, but it certainly is in the many thousands. But what we do know that is only 2% of the people that we have killed have been on this high-value target list, high-value Al-Qaeda targets. So who were all of the other thousands of people we killed? Innocent people, low-level Al-Qaeda people, low-level Taliban people, people who might have joined out of poverty because they had nothing else, people who joined for many, many different reasons, but not because they wanted to kill somebody in the United States necessarily. Where have we used these drones? We've used them a lot in the invasion of Iraq, in Afghanistan, Libya. Libya, a great example of how distorted the policy is, because when the Obama administration decided to get involved in Libya, they said, we're only using drones, and so no American lives are at risk, so this is not a war, so we don't have to even go to Congress to discuss this. So Congress, which is supposed to by Constitution have the right and the obligation to be the one to declare war, is no longer even in the playing field. It's now the executive branch. We've used them also in Pakistan, Yemen, Somalia, the Philippines, and now we are dotting the world with drone bases. In the Middle East, places like Oman, Kuwait, Qatar, Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia, we should be particularly concerned that there is a drone base, because if you recall, one of the reasons that Osama bin Laden said he hated the United States is because we had bases, our military bases, in the Holy Lands in Saudi Arabia. Under the Bush administration, those bases were closed down. Under the Obama administration, a new base has been opened for drones. In Afghanistan, it's very interesting to look at the increase in drone strikes in the recent years. So if you look at 2011, you'll see there were 294 Hellfire missiles shot. In 2012, just a year later, that almost doubled to 506. So as the US is preparing the drawdown of troops in Afghanistan, we are increasing the number of drone strikes. And unfortunately, I think we can assume that the troops might leave Afghanistan, but the drones will not be leaving. Pakistan is the place after Afghanistan where we have used the drones the most. Hundreds of strikes, almost all of them under the Obama administration, because under the Bush administration, there had been more of a policy of capturing people in countries like Pakistan and putting them into Guantanamo, indefinite detention, torture, rendition, all horrible policies. The Obama administration came in having run on the promise to close down Guantanamo, realized it wasn't as easy and he didn't want to expend the political capital to make that happen, and then really had a discussion inside the White House and decided that it would be cleaner and easier, instead of picking people up and putting them into Guantanamo, to simply kill them. And that's why the number of drone strikes has gone up dramatically under the Obama administration. I think one of the reasons, perhaps, that so many Americans think the drone strikes are okay is because they think they're more precise. There was actually a study that just came out last week of data that was put out, a study done by somebody that had been in the military, that showed that the drone strikes were 10 times as likely to have casualties, civilian casualties, as were airstrikes with manned pilots. So the idea that these are so precise is just false. But I also wonder if Americans ever had the chance to see some drone victims, which we never see on our television screens. Might they be more sympathetic and less likely to support the drone program? I would think so. This is a photographer, remember Chelsea and Tig, who we met when we were in Pakistan, who risks his life trying to film drone victims. And he said most of the times when he gets to the place of the drone strikes, there's nothing to photograph because the victims have been vaporized by the impact of these strikes. And you might only find pieces of flesh hanging here and there, and sometimes you don't even know if the piece of flesh is from an animal that had been killed or from a human being that had been killed. And so the pictures he takes tends to be people who were hit by the shrapnel or the flying debris from the drone strikes. But I do wish that the American people had a chance to see, especially some of the children who've been killed. One of the men that we met with when we were in Pakistan was Karim Khan, a journalist. This is what his home looked like after it was hit by the Hellfire missiles. And this is his son and his brother who were killed. He told us that the son and the brother worked in the local school as teachers. And one of the things that they taught was how important education was, and that education was much more powerful than a gun. Don't go join a group like the Taliban. Stay in school, get an education. So Karim Khan said to us, imagine the kind of lesson the hundreds of students learned when their beloved teachers were killed by a US drone. One of the ways that the drones are used are to kill individuals who have been identified, but then also there's something called a signature strike, where they're allowed to kill people on the basis of suspicious activities. Well, what happens then is that our Hellfire missiles oftentimes kill gatherings of people who come together for a variety of reasons. In the cases of Pakistan, a traditional gathering called a jirga, where they actually come together to resolve local disputes. And in this case, to the drone pilot thousands of miles away, it looks like a gathering of Taliban. They send in the missiles and kill, as in this case, some of the most respected leaders of the community. March 17, 2011, when the drones attacked a jirga, killing 42 people. You can imagine the hatred against the United States that spread after something like this. Stan talked about me being in the room when President Obama gave his speech on May 23rd. And one of the things he said in that speech is that the policy of his administration has been to capture suspected terrorists instead of killing them. Well, I would like him to tell that to the family of Tariq Aziz, a 16-year-old boy who went to the capital city in Islamabad along with other drone victim family members to see what they could do to try to get some justice out of the court systems, and how could they do better documentation of the way the drones are terrorizing their communities. And so they gave Tariq Aziz a video camera and said, go home and document the drone strikes. Go home and document the drone buzzing overhead terrorizing the community. And Tariq Aziz went home to do it, and 2 days later he was killed in a drone strike. If there was any reason to think that this 16-year-old was a high-value terrorist suspect that was about to do harm to Americans, why didn't they just capture him when he was sitting in the capital in Islamabad? Why didn't they give him a chance to have a trial? There was a study done by the two very prestigious universities, Stanford University and NYU, that brought out some very important issues that I incorporated into my book, Drone Warfare, because they said, don't just look at the number of people who have been killed and the number of people who have been maimed by our drones, but also look at the psychological terror of the drones to entire communities. Because these unmanned vehicles don't just come into a community, drop a bomb, and leave. They stay in the community doing surveillance for days, weeks at a time. Sometimes they're flying very low, and so the people hear the buzzing of the drones constantly and live in fear, never knowing when these drones are going to drop a missile, if they're going to, where it's going to be, who is going to be killed, are you going to be in the wrong place at the wrong time? And so the study, Living Under Drones, says the drones are really a way of collective punishment. They're a weapon that terrorizes entire communities. Well, as we learned in Pakistan, the Pakistani people have been protesting on every single level, from the community level up to the legislature, and even the highest officials in government, like the newly elected Nawaz Sharif, said that the US must stop the drone attacks, met with the US ambassador immediately after winning the elections. And has the United States listened to anybody in Pakistan? No. Continues with the drone strikes. When we were there, as a delegation of 34 Americans, we did protests in the capital of Islamabad together with drone victims. We did a day of fasting to commemorate the drone victims and show our opposition. And we tried to join a caravan up into the tribal areas where the drones are killing so many people. The government stopped us from getting as far as we wanted to get. But when we did get right into the border of the tribal areas, we had a rally, and we were able to go out and meet with this sea of local people who came to see these Americans. And I think both Tig and Chelsea will agree with me that we were all quite scared, because we had been told by our ambassador, don't go up to those tribal areas. The Taliban know you're coming. You have been on the TV screens every day. You've been in the newspapers. They're waiting for you. They will try to kill you. Our delegation went anyway, and when we got out into this crowd and heard the shouting, we didn't know what they were shouting until we made out they were saying, welcome, welcome, welcome. We want peace. We want peace. And as we had a chance to talk to them and tell them how upset we were with our own government's policies and how we thought that their lives were as precious as our lives, that their children were as important as our children, and that we would go back to do everything we could to stop these barbaric drone strikes, we just heard these tremendous cheers from the local people who had never heard Americans saying anything like that, and were so happy that we had come from so far to give out that message. Well, the same drone strikes that have been so counterproductive in Pakistan and led 3 out of 4 Pakistanis to call the United States its enemy have been stepped up in another country, and that is Yemen. Tig and I just returned with a small delegation from Yemen, but before we met, we were amazed that for the first time ever in the US Congress, they actually invited somebody from Yemen to come and testify about the effects of the drone strikes. And this young man testified on April 23rd before Congress. Well, he had been a journalist who had been doing some research about the drone strikes, but he never had any direct contact with them until the week before he was to come to the United States. Now, this is a young man from a very poor family in a very poor village, and he had had the great fortune of getting a scholarship to come as an exchange student in high school to live in the United States. And during that year, he fell in love with the United States, he fell in love with the American people, and we went back to his village into Yemen, talking about how great the United States was. So imagine 6 days before he's supposed to come to the United States, a drone is fired into his small village. And he said before Congress, "My village is so small it doesn't even appear on Google Maps. I would have never believed that it could be the site of an American drone strike. But my village first experienced America through the terror of the drones. What radicals had previously failed to achieve, one drone strike accomplished in an instant. Now there is intense anger and growing hatred of America." And this young man is afraid to go back to his village because he's now associated with the United States. When we were in Yemen, we had a chance to speak directly to people who lost their loved ones through drone strikes. This man traveled to the capital to meet with us. He has in his hand a picture of his brother and his nephew, who were taxi drivers. His brother was an educator by day, and to make some extra money for the family, drove a taxi at night. And one day, he was driving his taxi. 4 guys got into the taxi. They were driving along, and suddenly, they were killed by a Hellfire missile. His brother and nephew had nothing to do with Al-Qaeda. In fact, he got the Yemeni government to give him a certification saying, "My brother is a school teacher, nothing to do with militant activities." When Mohammed came to meet us, he brought the children who have now lost their father because of this drone attack. And he also brought with him pieces of the Hellfire missile that he carries around with him, with markings showing that it came from the United States. He told us that he thought the United States was a country of laws, that he had thought previously that perhaps the people who were being killed by the drones deserved it, because he didn't know any people who were killed by the drones until it happened to him. And now he says, what kind of barbarism is this? Something coming from the sky, killing my brother. And then when I try to get some acknowledgement, why did it happen? Nobody will talk to me. Nobody in the US Embassy will talk to me. They won't even acknowledge that they killed my brother. They won't apologize. They won't provide compensation so that I can take care of his children. When we asked how his brother's wife was doing, he said, "Not a day goes by without her sobbing. She just wakes up, eats, cries, and goes to sleep." And the US will do nothing to apologize to her. This is just one example of the many examples of families whose lives are destroyed by our drones. But you might say these are foreigners. Americans don't care very much about the killing of foreigners. Well, how about the killing of 16-year-old Abdul Rahman al-Awlaki, an American citizen killed by a drone attack in Yemen by the US government? And as we started out with a moment of silence for Trayvon Martin, we should also think about this 16-year-old, somebody who's actually killed by President Obama's policies. It's President Obama's drone policy that led to the death of this 16-year-old American. The family, we met with his grandfather while we were there, has still not received any kind of explanation from the US government about why this 16-year-old, together with his teenage cousins from Yemen, were killed in a drone strike. When we were there, we did protests in front of the US Embassy. We took on the two issues, the drone strikes and also the indefinite detention in Guantanamo, because the majority of people who are still in Guantanamo are coming from Yemen. The majority of people in Guantanamo who have been cleared for release, meaning Department of Justice, Department of Defense, the CIA, the FBI, Homeland Security, have all said they represent no threat to the American people, but they have still not been released. And so we stood in front of the American Embassy with family members who have loved ones in Guantanamo and family members who were killed by the drone strikes, to say to the US Embassy, we demand justice. Unfortunately, we didn't get a response, although we did succeed in convincing the US ambassador to meet for the first time ever with the Guantanamo families. And that just took place several days ago. But it seems like the ambassador got very scared and in the end decided the meeting could not be face-to-face, even though the US has every kind of security at the embassy that you can imagine. They still would not let these families inside the embassy. And so they had to have the, quote, meeting with the ambassador by a video conference, which the family members were so upset about. And they had the meeting, but the ambassador just listened and said that he was not a policymaker. There was nothing that he could do. So one has to ask the question, how is it that the United States gets away with going anywhere it wants, killing anybody it wants on the basis of secret information? And what if any other country in the world were doing this to us? It would be a declaration of war. But we shouldn't feel smug that no other country can do this to us because we are the mighty and we are the ones that have this awesome technology. Well, this is not like nuclear weapons. This is a technology that is being sold overseas by US companies that make the drones. The #1 exporter of the drones is the Israeli companies. In fact, one of their marketing bonuses is that they say that the drones are constantly being battle tested because they are constantly being used against the Palestinian people. The other country that's very big in the drone business is the Chinese, and there are now over 70 countries that have some kind of drone, the majority of them for surveillance purposes, but so were our lethal drones first surveillance drones, until we weaponize them. And there are many countries that have already or are in the process of weaponizing their drones. We must think that what goes around comes around, and we've got to be thinking about what is going to happen as more and more countries get these drones and start using them the way the US is using them. We also have to think about what's going to happen when our skies are full of drones. And there's only one reason why they are not right now, and that is because the Federal Aviation Administration is in charge of our airspace, and they know that these drones crash all the time. They know that these drones don't have the same kind of visibility as piloted drones have. But in the good old American fashion, the drone manufacturers have created a strong lobby group, and that lobby group now has its own drone caucus in Congress, and that drone caucus in Congress has pushed through legislation that says by the year 2015, the US airspace must be opened up to drones. In the meantime, the FAA has given out special permits to different groups, government agencies, companies, universities, like the university right here in Connecticut, to experiment with drones. But the drone manufacturers are really looking at the police departments, because they understand that there are 18,000 police departments in the United States, and they want to sell drones to each and every one of them. And you can imagine, after the Boston bombing, the kind of advertising campaign that the drone manufacturers have done with the police stations. So there are dozens of police stations that are now they're testing out the drones. I said that they crash all the time. This one in Montgomery County that you're looking at, they had a press conference to show off their new drone, and was quite funny because as soon as the drone went into the air, it crashed into the tank. And I don't know how destroyed it was, but probably the lesson from that is that we have to get a bigger, more expensive drone. And these police departments, are having a lot of cutbacks in their budgets right now. Well, Homeland Security has come forward and giving out grants to these police departments. In fact, gave a $100,000 grant to this police department to be able to buy the drones. So what can we do about all of this? Well, the positive thing is that there is a lot going on. On the local level, there are already communities, individual communities, that are passing no drone resolutions. And we are passing around a sign-up sheet that's going around now that we hope you'll sign on to, because we want to tell you about some of these initiatives that you can do right here in your own community. Pass a resolution that says a moratorium until we know how these drones are going to be used, or get the ACLU and other groups involved in writing the regulations for the use of these drones. And at the statewide level, there are many states that are involved right now in doing just that. Of course, the drone lobby comes in and tries to lobby the governor, and in a state like yours in Connecticut, they would say, but this is jobs, jobs, jobs. That's why we need, from the grassroots, a voice coming up and saying, no, we already live in a country that is way too involved in spying on us. We do not want drones overhead that will turn this into a 24/7 surveillance society, and could possibly even weaponize drones and use them against us here at home. On the international level, this movement has really grown tremendously in the last year. I told you that in February of 2012, 83% of Americans said it was just fine to use these weapons. Well, in the past year, there has been a dramatic shift in public opinion, so that the last opinion poll came out and said that there were 56% of the American people. That's a tremendous drop in numbers. And I think it's because of the work that people around this country have been doing to try to dispel the myth that these drones are so precise, that these drones are making us safer. There are protests at bases all over the United States now where the drones are being piloted. There are protests at the headquarters of the manufacturers of the drones. There are weekly protests at the headquarters of the CIA, at the Pentagon, in front of the White House, and in the offices of Congress itself, because Congress has done nothing to do the oversight that it's supposed to do. We're also encouraged now that finally the faith-based community that has been so silent about this has started to stir. I feel that this is one of the great moral and ethical issues of our time, and that we really have to get the faith-based community talking about the drones. So now there are groups of churches and church leaders who are questioning this policy. In fact, there is a reverend who is the head of the National Black Church Initiative, who wrote a very scathing critique of the drones, Reverend Anthony Evans. And he said, "If the church does not speak out against this immoral policy, we lose our moral voice, our soul, our right to represent and preach the gospel of Jesus Christ. This policy should be condemned by both liberal and conservatives, and especially those who love mercy, do justice, and walk humbly before God. There's also the beginnings of a movement at the universities, where universities are starting to do research about what kind of connections are there between their engineering departments and the military in the research of these drones. And on the international level, there are a couple of things happening. One, there is a campaign by scientists and human rights groups that know that this drone research is leading us into something even more disastrous than what we have, and that is autonomous drones that don't even have a remote pilot. They're drones that are pre-programmed to go out in swarms and go kill. And so this group has come together to try to stop the use of what they call killer robots before this has even started, and get a ban on them at the United Nations. There also is at the UN complaints and calls for investigation, and finally there's a study being done by the UN into potential war crimes by the United States and Israel for the use of these lethal drones, and that study should be coming out in the fall. We're very anxious to hear what it comes out and says. And in the meantime, we are trying to reach out to people in places like Afghanistan, Pakistan, Yemen. One of our staff people right now is in Pakistan and wrote to me today how she is meeting with drone victims because we're trying to bring them here to the United States. There has never been a family member of a drone victim in the United States, never allowed to come in. And so in November, on the 15th and 16th of November, not what it says on the slide, here in Washington, D.C., we are going to have a drone summit where we are working very hard to bring people from Yemen, from Afghanistan, from Pakistan, to tell their stories directly. And we're going to need your help to get their visas, because it's going to be a big fight with the State Department to get them to grant a visa to these drone victims to come here and tell us firsthand. And we will try hard to get them onto national media to tell their stories, because these stories must be heard. And I want to end just by saying what might be obvious to a group like this, which is that we have used now for over 11 years the hammer of the military to try to deal with this amorphous Al-Qaeda. Well, I talk in the book about a study done by the RAND Corporation, which is no leftist think tank, that looked at 268 terrorist organizations to look at how they came to their demise. And they've discovered that 40% of them came to their demise through better policing, that this was an issue for the police, that these were criminal acts. And that is something we heard very much in Yemen when we met with a mother, for example, whose 3 sons had joined Al-Qaeda. She said, it is like joining in with a gang. And you should think of it in the United States as a young person who got in with the wrong people for a variety of reasons. They need rehabilitation. They don't need to be killed with a drone. 40% reincorporate them into the political system through negotiations, through rehabilitation. And only 7% of these terrorist groups were ever, quote, defeated through the military. Well, after 11 years, I think we ought to conclude that the military way just does not work. And that all we are doing now is feeding the military-industrial complex. All we are doing is feeding the companies that profit so handsomely from these drones. And all we are doing is perpetuating the cycle of violence. That if countries in other parts of the world only know us through Predator drones, through Reaper drones, through Hellfire missiles, what are we going to reap but hellfire and hatred? But if they know us through different means, if we reduce dramatically our military footprint by bringing our soldiers back from Afghanistan, by closing the over 800 military bases we have in other people's countries, by strengthening our State Department, the diplomatic arm of our government, by talking to our enemies, by funding development projects that can bring people out of poverty, and think of the trillions of dollars we have spent on war and how much good we could have done in the lives of poor people around the world. If we show friendship, if we show mutual respect, if we show love, put this together in a package, and what will we reap? We will reap respect, we will reap friendship, we will be much more loved around the world, and we will be safer here at home. So let's ground the drones and the wars and build the peace. Thank you so much.